Hello. We would like to welcome you to another Platform Ukraine event. This time, this kind of duo Timothy Snyder and also Robert Brinkley, the head of the Bertrand. And Robert Brinkley will then introduce Timothy Snyder with all the relevance. I would like to just also introduce my colleague Anna, who will be talking about the events we are planning for you as well. Platform Ukraine is a PhD-led initiative of School of Stalin and European Studies at UCL, and our main objective is to interconnect all the Ukrainian research centers, but also the other research centers, academics, professionals, and also students and people who are in general interested in what is going on in post-Soviet territory and how the ongoing situation in Ukraine is actually changing our understanding of the post-Soviet territory. We believe that it's very important because we disagree with what is going on in Ukraine and we would like to help. So, with that being said, I'll pass the word to Anna Kara, who will tell you about the other events, and then I'll take the microphone again to thank everyone who has helped us with this event.
Thank you, Unrai. Yes, we have another event tomorrow, which will be on identity with a fascinating panel, and it's not booked out yet, so go to our website and get yourself a ticket. And our events are not limited to London, so we'll also have an event coming up in Housum at the beginning of April. So should you find yourself somewhere in the Baltic States, maybe it's worthwhile coming. And we'll have a great conference. Unfortunately, our call for papers is closed, but I'm sure you can sit in and listen to some of the presenters, which will take place in June. And yeah, this is about it. And I'll hand you back over.
We have quite a long list of people, organizations, institutions to thank. First of all, we would like to thank Professor Timothy Snyder, who so kindly agreed to give this lecture. Second of all, we would like to also thank all of you for coming here and being interested in this topic. Second of all, we would like to thank all the students who have been helping us, also all of SEEDS, our alma mater in UCL, and also UCL Vice Provost Office, who've been so kind and been supporting us throughout the whole year. And if I might not forget, also Sealbus, who's been supporting us financially throughout for the forthcoming conference, and also PDU, who's been helping us with setting up this event. With that being said, I pass the word to Robert Brinkley, who will introduce the rest of the section.
Well, thank you, Andre. It really is a great pleasure for me this evening to be able to introduce Professor Timothy Snyder, who is very well known as a historian of what he has called in his book, The Bloodlands, the lands between Russia and Germany. His lecture this evening is called Ukraine, the War for Truth, a very relevant topic today as well. Timothy Snyder is the Housum Professor of History at Yale University. He's the author of Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which came out in 2010. And his History of the Holocaust, Black Earth, will be published by Bodley Head in September this year. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford in 1997, where he was a British Marshall Scholar. Before joining the faculty at Yale in 2001, he held fellowships in Paris and Vienna and an academy scholarship at Harvard. He's the author of 5 award-winning books and the co-editor of 2 more. Bloodlands has received a number of honours, including the Leipzig Prize for European Understanding and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award in the Humanities. It has been translated into more than 20 languages and was a bestseller in 4 countries. I don't need to tell you about the importance of understanding history if we're to understand what is happening today. And I think nor do I need to point out the determined efforts that are being made to obscure the truth, to obfuscate, to confuse, and frankly just to lie about what is really happening. So, all the more important then, that we should listen to someone who has researched into history been striving to find out what the truth is so that we can apply those lessons in trying to understand what is going on today. I'm very much looking forward to listening to Professor Snyder, and he's kindly said that after his lecture, he's ready to answer questions. If you have a mobile phone, please silence it now. Professor Snyder.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks to Platform Ukraine for this invitation and for all that you do. Thus far, it's unfortunately the case that the best things that happen in and around with regard to Ukraine come from the bottom up. We could all hope for the day when that's no longer the case, right? But for now, that is the case. When I heard Bodley speaking about not agreeing with what is happening in Ukraine, one can't but be sympathetic to that sentiment. Unfortunately, what is happening in Ukraine is also part of what is happening in the European Union and in the West, broadly speaking. And the premise of what I'm going to be saying this evening is that an understanding of what's happening in Ukraine is also an understanding of what's happening in Europe. That after a year of this, the processes are essentially the same thing. And by the end, I hope you might be convinced, as I am, that ironically, Russia's war in Ukraine has succeeded better beyond the boundaries of Ukraine than it has succeeded within the boundaries of Ukraine. In other words, we non-Ukrainians, have turned out in many ways to be softer targets than Ukrainians themselves. This is part of the case that I want to make. Now, now, if you're half Ukrainian and half not, you're probably puzzling, like, am I half a soft target and half a hard target, and where's the line? But anyway, try not to puzzle about that. Before this audience, I don't have to defend this subject or its significance, but I do want to begin with a few general remarks about history, because as Robert Brinkley was kind enough to say, that there is a relationship between the past and the present and what's said about the present. It's a very dim relationship, but nevertheless, I think it helps us and it behooves us to have some sense of our own about what the past is, rather than constantly being forced to rethink the past in terms of yesterday's propaganda or today's or tomorrow's. So let me just make a couple of very brief introductory points about history, and in particular about the relationship between Russia and Ukrainian history. Don't worry, I'm not going to detain you with lots of silly remarks about language and ethnicity. If you have silly questions about language and ethnicity, I'm happy to entertain them later, but I assume I don't have to waste your time with that. Because the seriousness of history, it does not reside in the imaginary of the ethnic. It doesn't reside in what language one happens to speak. I'm here in England, and thus far no one has claimed to be in English. I've been flagrantly speaking English for several days in a row now, and no one has claimed that I'm English, right? No one has given me English citizenship or subjecthood or whatever it might be. So we all know that these language and ethnicity things are red herrings. But history does have a certain reality, and I want to make a couple or 3 points about it. One of them has to do with the big, sometimes half-imaginary turning points in the past, like 988, when Vladimir Volodymyr may or may not have converted to Christianity. He may or may not have been a Muslim when he did so. It's a bit of a mythical date. Or 1241, the Mongol conquest of Kiev and Rus, right? Or let's say 1569, the formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These are big turning points in the history of both Ukraine and Russia. And I do think it's fair to say that as a kind of brief shorthand, they do give you some kind of difference in the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians towards Europe itself. And if I could summarize that difference, it would be something like this. There are no major trends in European history, as we are taught it, and as Ukrainians are taught it, and as Russians are taught it, which pass Ukraine by. They got the Vikings, They got the Jews, they got the Middle Ages, they got the Reformation, they got the Counter-Reformation, they got the Renaissance, they got Latin, they even got a little bit of Greek. They got colonized, admittedly by the Poles, which maybe doesn't count as much, but they got colonized. They had anti-colonial wars, right? There's no major tendency in European history which passes you from by, right? So the question of whether Ukraine is a European place is not really a question, right? Or it's not. If you reject Ukraine's European history, you're doing something, let's say, willful, right, or voluntaristic. With Russia, it's different, right? With Russia, the Muscovy, unlike Ukraine, which falls under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which falls under the Bolshevik Commonwealth, Muscovy is essentially a successor state of the Tatar Khanate, of the Golden Horde. When Muscovy becomes Russia and makes the move towards identifying with Europe, it is a move, right? It is a choice. When Petersburg is built as a window to Europe, when Peter defines Russia as an enlightening, self-enlightening European state, that is a move. The debates in the 19th century between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers, which continue to this day, and I think will continue probably forever, those are about the choice. Do you have a choice to be European or not? And that, I think, is the difference, one difference between Ukraine and Russia with respect to the past. I'm not saying, by the way, that Ukraine is Europe in some virtuous sense of the word, and that Russia is not, and that's terrible. I'm just saying that there is, I think, a historical legacy, which means that Ukrainians, for better and for worse, and often it is for worse, have a relationship with the main trends of European history, which is organic and without interruptions. Whereas for Russia, it's much more a matter of political choice. And one sees that, for example, in the way that Russian policy towards Europe can shift back and forth rather radically, as it has in the last few years. Okay. The second moment of history, and I'm using the word moment very broadly, which is worth thinking about in a slightly different way, perhaps, in the history of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, Russia and Ukraine were the two most important Soviet republics. Their Soviet inheritances are absolutely indubitable. But there are certain ways in which the Soviet inheritances resonate differently now, after 1991, and especially after 2013. The first of them would have to do with the year 1933, or the end of Stalin's five-year plan. No one denies that there was a five-year plan. No one of any significance denies that the five-year plan led to a great deal of starvation across the Soviet Union. But in general, people in Ukraine believe that there was, within this collectivization and the associated starvation, that there was a deliberate attempt to channel starvation within Ukraine. They happen to be right about this. But in general, they believe this, and the experience of famine is very, very widespread in Ukraine. More widespread than anywhere in the Soviet Union, except for northern Kazakhstan and some bits of southern Russia. That is a part of memory in the very simple human sense, which can't be done away with. There are too many grandparents who remember this, or great-grandparents at this point. Whereas Russians are likely to say, yes, there was a famine, but we suffered too, and everybody suffered equally, it was part of the Soviet Union, etc. Right? So that's a fundamental difference. 1945 is also interesting, because 1945 is an example of a memory which was similar, and which is now spreading apart. So how is it similar? Well, the Soviet myth of the Second World War, the myth of the Great Fatherland War, was a common myth across the Soviet Union, for the very simple reason that everyone in the Soviet Union fought in the war, regardless of nationality. The Red Army was a multinational army, right? It wasn't a Russian army, a Ukrainian army, or whatever, a Georgian army. It was a multinational army. And the myth of the war that starts in 1941 and ends in triumph in 1945 was a common. Now, there was a difference in the myth already built in before 1991, and that has to do with the experience of occupation. For Ukraine, as for Belarus, the war is a war of the experience of occupation, because the Germans were present in all of the territory of Ukraine for a very long time, as in Belarus. This is something Ukraine and Belarus have in common. This is less true for Russians and for Russia. The German army occupied about 5% of the territory of present-day Russia. 5%, right? So the memory of the war for Russians is much more of a war that is fought somewhere beyond where you live. Now, that occupation in Russia was horrible. I wouldn't want to minimize it. 60,000 Jews killed, the starvation of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad. But compared to Ukraine, there is something qualitatively different here. And this matters a bit, because the way the war is remembered in Ukraine has much to do with things that happened at home, as opposed to things that happened somewhere else, right? For people who inhabit 95% of the territory of Russia, the war happened somewhere else. For everyone in Ukraine, the war is something that happened here. So that's already a bit of a difference. The difference has grown considerably since 2013. And it's grown not so much because the myth of the war has changed, although that's happened too. It's grown because of its resonance. The way, as all of you will know, the way that Russian propaganda has mythicized the war of aggression in Ukraine has been almost exclusively through the symbolism of the Second World War, right? So nothing is certain, right, in human life. But I will wager the prediction that in May of this year, the way that Russia commemorates the anniversary of the Second World War will be to present the war in Ukraine as an echo of the war of liberation against Germany. And the only reason I think that is because they keep telling me that's what they're going to do, so I take their word for it. I also don't think they have any other ideas. This, however, has so in Russian propaganda, as any of you who watch RT know, or as any of you have any experience with that reality, that alternative reality know, is drawing from this very vivid and traumatic storehouse of symbolism. The way Ukrainians understand the war is much, 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 much less mythicized for the very simple reason that the war is actually happening on Ukrainian territory to actual human beings, right? So of course I'm not saying Ukrainians agree about what the war means or what the revolution meant. All I'm saying is that for them it is primarily experience, right? Having a revolution, having a counter-revolution, having an invasion, those are experiences which tend to trump symbolism. So again, you see this difference, but now it's been magnified. For Russians, again, except for the Russians who are actually fighting and dying in Ukraine, right, of whom there are some, and their families, but for Russians in general, the war in Ukraine is something that happens somewhere else. Whereas for Ukrainians, the war in Ukraine is obviously something that's happening in their, in their place where they live, right? So the difference, the main difference, is that the war of 41 to 45 is receding in significance in Ukraine. And so the traditional disputes about West Ukraine and Central Ukraine and so on, these things are receding in significance. Whereas the war of 1945, you wouldn't want to say it's receding in significance in Russia. It's not. It may be becoming stranger and more abstract, but it's no less important now than it was 3 years ago. Probably it's a little bit more important. Okay. So there's been this shift in the dominant myth, right? The dominant myth in Ukraine, I think it's fair to say, is about the last 2 years. Whereas the dominant myth in Russia is still about 1941 to 1945. Okay. So again, I don't have to rehearse with you at great length the contemporary history of the revolution, the counter-revolution, and the war. But I do want to introduce a few things which seem to be important for then analyzing the way that we talk about these things and the significance of various kinds of challenges to truth. So, as most of you will know, the relevant bit of backdrop to the Maidan, the crisis in Ukraine, was a certain tilt in Russian foreign policy, which followed a certain bent in Russian domestic policy, namely the response to the protests of late 2011 and early 2012 in Russia. At that time, I mean, this is all faded into the background. We forget about this because we think of Ukraine and the war. But at that time, those protests seemed very significant, right? Evgeny Albat, who's a very smart journalist, said, today we have proved that civil society does exist in Russia, that the middle class does exist, and this country is not lost, right? That's one account of what was happening in these protests. President Putin had a different account. He said, Hillary Clinton set the tone for some actions in our country and gave them a signal. They heard the signal and with the support of the US State Department began active work. I'm not endorsing that theory of what happened, by the way. I'm just pointing to it as a theory of what happened because it's going to surface again in a very significant way. As a result of those events in Russia, Putin and his entourage and that administration, that regime, tilted their domestic policies away from the middle class and towards a broader base, generally deeper in Russian society. This was consistent with a new orientation in foreign policy, which was emerging in 2013 called Eurasianism. The idea of which was essentially to abandon the middle class and their cosmopolitan, ruthless interests, and to move towards conservative ideas involving the church, involving what Americans used to call family values before we got over it, right? Before we got over it. Right? So I'm from Ohio. Like Russia today reminds me of Ohio in the 1990s. So it gives me hope that you can get over it, right? If Ohioans can get over it, and certainly Russians can get over it. Okay. But so the Eurasianism was a turn against this kind of cosmopolitan universalism represented by the middle classes. But in foreign policy, it was also a turn in particular against I'm sorry to all of you who didn't get the I reference, by the way. I'll just keep repeating it over and over again. The turn against these values is also a turn against the specific institution of the European Union, which in 2013 is treated as an adversary in Russian foreign policy. That's a technical classification. And it's described increasingly on Russian television as not only as an adversary, but as something which is decadent, which is a very significant term, right? Decadent means that you're decaying, you're falling apart, you have no future. It also means, of course, that you're gay and you're fascist, or gay and fascist, or fascist and gay. But the idea is that this European Union, is not long lived. Now, and then there's a replacement for this, which is the Eurasian Union, which is to begin as a trade agreement between Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, but eventually, as Foreign Minister Lavrov put it, is to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So meanwhile, while Russian foreign policy is already making this tilt against Europe, against the European Union, as this, as the Slavophile Westernizer debate, turns once again towards the Slavophile side, in Ukraine something else has happened. Over the course of the year 2013, the old government, the previous government, the Yanukovych government, was juicing up the propaganda in favor of an association agreement, right? If you were on Ukrainian talk shows or watching Ukrainian talk shows, you realized that a clear tilt had taken place in domestic Ukrainian propaganda towards the association agreement. And it was popular. This was something that Yanukovych had in common with most of his people, that there should be an association agreement with the European Union. This changes very rapidly at the end of November 2013, when after a discussion with President Putin, President Yanukovych decides that he's not, in fact, going to sign the association agreement with the European Union. What actually happened in that conversation is the subject of much discussion. I'm happy to share my views, but not in this part of the conversation. But the key thing is that Russian foreign policy against the European Union now takes shape, or now takes form, right? Dissuading Ukraine from from signing the association agreement with the European Union is not so much an anti-Ukrainian policy, it's an anti-European policy. It's trying to show the limits of European power. Now, the problem with this is that Ukrainians actually are in favor of this. And as a result of this shift in foreign policy, you have an activation of Ukrainian students first who come out and protest in Kiev on the Maidan. The key Facebook post, as many of you will know, is from an interesting Russophone Ukrainian journalist of Afghan origin called Mustafa Naim. He's the one who actually starts all of this. The students are then beaten by the riot police, and then they're joined by, well, their parents in a lot of cases, but also by Red Army veterans, by Afghansi. So there's a sort of funny, like, one Afghan to another sequence here. An Afghan starts it, and then Afghan veterans continue it. That doesn't happen very often. So you have this sort of interesting accumulation of civil society. And I mean that seriously. People were represented from all generations, all backgrounds, very quickly. And why were they there? What did they care about? What was significant about this association agreement? Why would you be beaten or later risk death for a trade agreement with the European Union, right? I mean, a question, right, which in England, well, why would you, right? So, and the answer is that for the people who did take these risks, and this is something we're taking seriously in this country, frankly, for the people who did take these risks, the answer was that the European Union represented the rule of law. The thing that they did not have, and still do not have, at home is the rule of law, in the basic sense of predictability. So as a result, this revolution was begun by students, the people who had the most to lose from not having predictability in their future, and it was supported largely by, and here's the part where I always make at least one Ukrainian annoyed, it was supported largely by the Russian-speaking Kiev middle class, small and medium-sized businessmen and businesswomen who saw the glass ceiling of corruption above them and couldn't break through it. Right? So this was very much a kind of bourgeois revolution, if you like, although you could also do the left-wing revolution because it was against a de facto oligarchy. So Russian policy is to turn Ukraine away from the association agreement. There were these protests, and then what follows is Russian propaganda. Now, interestingly, the Russian propaganda at this time, in December 2013, was not about NATO, not about the Americans. I mean, we got ours later on. We're still getting it, and we'll get it indefinitely because we are a really beautiful target. But the propaganda at this time was all about Swedish pedophilia, right? The Great Northern War, Polish aggression in Ukraine, things like this, right? It was all about the European Union and its civilizational decline. Why? Because the policy against Maidan was a policy against Europe, right? So the claim that was made that if Ukraine joins the European Union, then Ukrainian men have to marry European men, right? That is, there's mandatory gay marriage in the European Union and varieties of this, right? This is propaganda. I'm glad I made you guys laugh. You're looking pretty topic turned up today. This was consistent with this larger trend in Russian propaganda against Europe, right? So the Maidan was called the Euro Maidan, the European Maidan, and then in Russian propaganda it was presented as the gay Euro Maidan, which sounds slightly better in Russian, but not much. So the gist of Russian propaganda was this civilizational push against Europe. Russian policy was also to offer a very large loan to the Yanukovych government in return for putting down the protests, right, which was public. Medvedev said this very clearly. There's nothing secret about this. This led to, presumably, the dictatorship laws of January 2014, as well and probably to the Snyder massacres of February 2014, which led to the revolution, which led to the end of the regime. Now, the killings that took place on the Maidan in January and especially in February reflected the kinds of people who were taking part. As again, as probably all of you know, the first two people who died were a Belarusian and an Armenian, and then among the people who died were not only ethnic Ukrainians, if you believe in ethnicity, but Russians, Poles, Jews. It's the same variety of people who live in Kiev or who live in Ukraine. And this moment, the overturning of Yanukovych's flight, the overturning of the government, was the same moment when the Russian invasion begins with Crimea. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to say a word now about the form that the Russian invasion has taken, it is taking. Not because I think the war in Ukraine is the most important thing that's happening. I don't. I think it's a significant part, but not the most important part of this general policy against European integration. But I think it's a telling part, and it tells in a certain way, which I want to try to explain. The way this war has been fought is by a tactic which I would call reverse asymmetry. Okay, so I'm now going to go all military historical. So an asymmetrical war, as those of you who are in military service or have studied these things will know, is an assembly of the weapons of the weak. It's usually guerrillas or partisans who are fighting a state, some of us better organized armed force, and they do things like not have insignia, not have uniforms, hide among civilians, deliberately draw fire onto cities and other settlements in order to make the civilians upset and get them on your side. In other words, they use human shields, right? All of the things which the Russians did in Crimea, and which they and their supporters have done in Donetsk and in Lugansk. So the odd thing about this, of course, is that Russia is the stronger side in the war, right? I mean, with all due respect to people who are taking risks and dying in the Ukrainian army, there is no real comparison between the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces. So it's odd that Russia would be pursuing using the weapons of the weak when they are quite obviously profoundly the party of the strong. So this is combined then, of course, with a story, and the story is meant to justify it. The story is that there aren't Russians in Ukraine. I mean, so admittedly, Putin gives up on there aren't Russians in Crimea. Like, and you should be ready for this, because this is the kind of lying which we're going to get about Donetsk and Luhansk. So now there are no Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk until they admit that there will be, and they will admit it, and then basically they're going to laugh at all of this, just like they laughed at all of this after Crimea, right? The line in Crimea was those aren't Russian soldiers, until Putin officially admitted that they were, right? Which is what we can expect with Luhansk and Donetsk at some point when we are sufficiently prepared and humiliated. In any event, the story is that there aren't Russians, these are local resistors, it's a heroic anti-fascist underground, and so on. It's a civil war. The reality, of course, as the war shifts from Crimea to Luhansk, is that it's Russian technology and Russian soldiers who ground the Ukrainian Air Force, which is the most important development in this war. Russian fighters are also grounding Ukrainian Air Force. Russian big guns and the associated Russian crews have been until recently, and probably still are fighting in Ukraine. Occasionally, they shoot down civilian aircraft. That's a point I'm going to return to. And thousands of Russians at this point have probably died on Ukrainian territory. Now, the point of this story, though, is that it reveals the story that this is a civil war, that these are heroic anti-fascist underground and so on. The point of the story is that the story, in fact, justifies its tactics, right? It's meant to go along with the tactics. If you pretend that you're the weak, then you can also pretend that the weapons of the weak are justified. And of course, the way this sort of works ultimately is that even when Russia admits, as its leaders eventually always do, because they like to lie for us to us long enough until we get humiliated, and then they tell us the truth, so we feel more humiliated. That's part of this whole game. The way this sort of ultimately works is by saying these are local anti-fascist heroes fighting the United States of America and its global conspiracy, right? Fighting the NATO Foreign Legion, fighting the Americans, fighting Blackwater, fighting the Polish army, which landed in Crimea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are the underdog, is the point, right? So the idea is to say that since these, this supposedly ramshackle group of people with pitchforks is fighting the American superpower, they are the underdogs, right? Therefore, all of this is justified. Now, the way it's been described, though, is also very interesting. And I'm moving to the next point about strategy. The way it's been described is very interesting because even as Russian leaders deny that they're taking part, they give some really interesting rationales for why there should be a war, why Ukraine should lose that war. And these are things which I would refer to as the beginning of the strategy of strategic relativism. They begin by relativizing the existence of Ukraine. Ukraine is a composite state, for example. People in Ukraine speak Russian, therefore they must be Russians. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, therefore its existence today is questionable. There's something called the Ruski Mir, right? There's a Russian civilization. These sorts of things are all meant to relativize the existence of. Another one was when the Maidan happened. This is Putin explaining why the Budapest Memorandum was violated. When the Maidan happened, Ukrainian state ceased to exist. Therefore, all things are possible. So all of these kinds of claims are meant to relativize the existence of the Ukrainian state as this war is going on. Now, as I see it, this is part of a larger strategy which accepts and exploits weakness. Because, of course, it is true that in many ways, in what one might have thought were relevant ways, Russia is weak compared, not to the Americans, because the Americans are irrelevant, but compared to the European Union, right? Russia exports about as much as the Netherlands. Its GDP is about the size of France. Compared to the European Union as a whole, as a tiny economy, which is massively overdependent upon the exports of things that are traditionally exported by backward colonial states, hydrocarbons and so on. So compared to the EU, Russia is weak, but what Russia has done is it's elucidated a kind of doctrine. Admittedly, I'm calling it strategic relativism. They haven't started calling it that. But the basic idea is that when you are weak, the thing to do is to bring the adversary down to your level. Right? So Russia has certain weaknesses, which I think they understand perfectly well, demographic, technological. The thing about them is the thing about Russia is that they understand their weaknesses and they understand ours. So they understand the weaknesses of Europe. Right? They understand us much, much, much better than we understand them. And they've demonstrated that in the last year quite beautifully. So strategic relativism means weakening the adversary by breaking up the connections that exist. So in this setting, breaking up the Ukrainian state is just one part of a much larger effort, which has a bunch of levels. One of them is the transatlantic level, right? Let me put it this way. Russia has done little in the last couple of years to improve American-European relations, right? I mean, they've been very concerned to exploit all opportunities to separate Europeans and Americans. Snowden comes to mind. The leaks, the phone leaks out of context come to mind. This whole idea of geopolitics, that the Americans are responsible for all of this, which is crazy nonsense, is part of this. But the heart of this effort is not the transatlantic relationship. The heart of this effort is the European Union itself. In the last year, the Russian state has pursued at 5 or 6 or 7 levels a strategy of disintegrating the European Union, and with unbelievable success, I have to say. Unbelievable success. In fact, to such an extent that I think the things that they initially thought were tactics in the war on Ukraine have now become a strategy, because they're doing much better in Europe than they're doing in Ukraine. They're doing surprisingly well here. I wouldn't be surprisingly well anyway. Maybe disagree. What are these things they do? Well, they recruit client states inside the European Union, Hungary, and then they try with Cyprus, Greece, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Austria. They support separatism of all kinds, right? So the separatism of states from the European Union, like UKIP, they like that. They like UKIP. The Scottish referendum, they were big on the Scottish referendum. I understand people can like Scottish independence for various kinds of reasons, right? Personally, I also couldn't get my castle back, but I was. Okay, it's not a short. Our tea is now in black. class me as like a feudal aristocrat. No, I understand that there are legitimate reasons why people could have serious views on one side of the issue or another. But from the point of view of Russian foreign policy, the Scottish referendum is an example of how the EU can fall apart. So you may not have noticed that they called for a recount of the Scottish referendum. No, they did. They called for a recount. They said it was fraud, and then it should be in Scotland that actually voted for independence. So separatism at the level of states, separatism within states, that client separatism, and then support of the populist right, the Front National in France, Jobbik in Hungary, and then outright support of really nasty versions of the far right. I mean, much nastier than that. The fascists and the Nazis who they invite to supervise the electoral farce in Crimea, which they call a referendum, and then the electoral farces in Donetsk and Luhansk. The people who go there are Die Linke from Germany, interesting story, and basically neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, and some populists. So, in all of these, what do all these people have in common, right? Aside from being white, what do they all have in common? Okay, most of them. They have in common that they are in favor of destroying the European Union, right? One way or another, and that's the way they go about with Russian foreign policy. I'm not at all convinced that Russian foreign policy is ideologically aligned with this, but this is the overlapping interests. Meanwhile, there's a fundamental interest having to do with preserving access to natural gas markets. So if you look at the Russian policy in the Balkans, for example, it's quite clear now towards Turkey that they're looking for ways to make sure, the regime is looking for ways to make sure, because this doesn't help Russians at all, but they're looking for ways to make sure that they have access to the European Union. Why is this a live issue? Because once Russia attacked Ukraine, then people inside the European Union started talking about a common energy policy, right? Which frankly, on a whole lot of grounds, would be a really good idea. Even if there weren't a war in Ukraine going on, that would be a really good idea, a common energy policy. And Russia's geared up to stop that. Right, if you raise your hand as a common energy policy, the next day there'll be 5 conferences in Berlin explaining why that's a bad idea. Just try it. Just try it. It's true. And this actually has to sort of out on Crimea. So okay, Crimea, like many of us are happy to see Crimea as like the least important part of this war. But actually Crimea is significant in a way which we overlook, which is that Crimea is the only place in the Black Sea where there are discovered shale gas reserves, right? In what used to be Ukrainian, in what are legally Ukrainian territorial waters, but which Russia has now claimed. Now, why is that important? Not because the Russians are going to mine it, they don't have the technology, and they don't need it, but it means that the Ukrainians can't have it, and it means that the Europeans can't have it. And don't think they didn't think of that, right? We may not think of it, but denying the Europeans that, I think, is part of the plan. Anyway, along with this goes a certain philosophy. So you break things up at all levels, and including down to the level of civil society, which is a very important level of all this. So it's not just that Russian policy opposed the Maidan because the Maidan was a threat because Russians might imitate it and so on. I mean, I think that's perfectly true. I don't think that Russian authorities look kindly upon a bunch of Russian speakers in another post-Soviet state overthrowing the government. I don't think they look kindly upon that, but there's something deeper going on there, which is the question of whether civil society actually exists or not, right? I mean, is it possible that you were not all paid off to be here, right? Like that's phrasing the question in a certain way. I assure you that Platform Ukraine did not pay me off to be here, so really the question is to you, right? Why are you all here? Okay, some of you were paid, I'm sure, but I'm sure that because I spent too much time in these places. But the question is something like this possible, right? Is it possible that people voluntarily associate for temporary goals and so on? Is Platform Ukraine possible, right? Is this kind of thing possible? Are universities possible? Or are they not possible? Do they always represent, are they always just, the cat's paw of some international plot or another, right? This is not cat's paw, by the way, an international plot, right? And this is a fundamental philosophical question. And the thing is, you can get it wrong, you can still be right. That is, the correct answer is there is such a thing as civil society, but if you don't believe in it, you can prevent it from existing, right? You can stop it. And one of the ways of stopping it is by denying that it exists and acting consistent with that view, right? Which is what the NKVD did, for example, with great success in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. So so this view is wrong, but it's enforceable. Okay. Now, this brings me to what I take to be the philosophy of all of this, and now we're getting finally towards this question of truth. The philosophy of what I take to all this is what I would call applied postmodernism. Okay. So So some of the propaganda, admittedly, is quite standard. I mean, some of the propaganda uses standard techniques that we all know, right? So you just make things up that aren't true, right? So the claim that the Ukrainian army crucified a young boy, right? Just not true, right? Just not true. That's a standard kind of propaganda. You make things up. Another kind of propaganda which is standard is the liberation from context. So if President Obama is unfortunate enough to say anything about Ukraine, he can then trust that like 4 or 5 words will then be taken out of context and there'll be a whole documentary on Russia Today, sorry, RT, which leads up to those 4 words and shows how sinister they are, right? That's liberation from context. But they do that beautifully. They do it better than anybody else. They do it better than Fox News, who I think is the prototype. No, I think it is the prototype. I mean, I'm serious. This is one big crisis, right? I mean, the Russians understand this. The Russians understand the West for a reason. And that reason is the same reason why we can start understanding them, because it's all one problem. It's all one problem. So there are these standard things, liberation from context. But then there are some other things which they do rather better than people do in the West, like, for example, political marketing. So by political marketing, I mean targeting a very strong message to the people who want to hear it, will believe it, will in some way be mobilized by it, regardless of whether that is consistent with the political marketing they use for other people, right? So, for example, the main 2 messages that have been politically marketed are fascism and geopolitics. The idea that all Ukrainians are fascists, or all the fascists are Ukrainians, or whatever it was, this was a very powerful idea in Europe especially, because the European left doesn't like fascism, and they're right not to like fascism. And because also it triggers all this Manichaean thinking about people being on the right side or people being on the wrong side. That has lost a lot of steam, mainly because it's ridiculous, but after a year or so it's lost a lot of steam. But it takes a long time to get over these things. The message which has succeeded it is the geopolitical message. That it's all about geopolitics, and the Americans are really responsible for it. There are no such thing as Ukrainians or Ukrainians really. It's all just a big plot. It's the Americans. And this is targeted also mainly towards Europeans, because if you think it's all the Americans, then you can think, well, if they started it, let them finish it. That's the slightly more benevolent version. And then there's a slightly more sinister version, which is if it's all the Americans, then maybe Russia's really the underdog, and we should side with the underdog because Russia's really the underdog. That's the way geopolitics is supposed to work. Again, it's sort of ludicrous, but it has worked very effectively. Those two messages, fascism and geopolitics, have basically stopped serious discussion, or slowed it, right? Hindered it for about a year now. So this is serious stuff. Now, this political marketing can be very contradictory, right? So I can tell one constituency, for example, I already mentioned this, but I can tell one constituency, my conservative constituency over here, that Ukraine is gay. And I can tell another constituency over here that Ukraine is fascist, right? And if I get caught in this, I don't mind. It can be both gay and fascist and gay. But also, and slightly more seriously, I think, you can tell this constituency, your left-wing constituency or your Jewish constituency, you can say Ukraine's anti-Semitic, they're all anti-Semites, they're Nazis. And then you can tell this constituency, your far-right-wing constituency, your neo-Nazi constituency, that Ukraine is part of the international Jewish conspiracy. Right? That its existence is a front for the international Jewish conspiracy. And you can seriously do both of those things, even though one might say those things contradict, right? And that's because they're targeted for different audiences. Now, where does this bring us? Well, I mean, I think the us is the crucial part about this. I think it has brought us, for many of us anyway. I mean, I see a lot of clear-eyed individuals in the room, but it has brought many of us into an interesting place where. Oh, sorry, I forgot something. There's the thing they do particularly well, and this also comes from Fox News, is what I think of as orchestrated cacophony. So most propaganda is about stuff that you're doing yourself, and you know you're doing it, right? So you know you're fighting the war in Ukraine, therefore you say we're doing it against the fascists or the Americans or whatever. But sometimes things happen you don't expect, right? Like you shoot down a civilian airline, and then you have to improvise. And the way you improvise, when you're not quite sure what to do, is you bring in a bunch of people who tell different stories about it. Right? So in the case of MH17, the stories were things like a Ukrainian fighter shot it down, which is technically impossible, or there's a natural disaster, or, and I know all of you have heard this before, or MH17 was actually the same Malaysian plane which disappeared over the Pacific Ocean, and recovered and brought back to the Atlantic, filled with corpses, and then put over Ukraine and shot down remotely to create the appearance. Right. Now, the point of these stories is not that you actually believe them, right? The point of these stories is that by the time you get through reciting those versions of the event, The actual event, the tragedy of 300 people dying, right, for no reason, is lost. That's lost. Those people are out of the picture, and the picture has been replaced by this cacophony, by all these images, right? And the real question, which has a very simple answer, who shot it down? Russia shot it down. It's that question, that answer, Occam's razor gets completely blunted, blurred. It's out of the picture. So where did this bring us all? And this is where I really want to go with all of this. It's brought us pretty far along the line towards, a way of thinking the world, which I think arguably we invented ourselves and is now being brought back to us. A way in which we're fairly happy to admit contradictions, at least provisionally, where provisionally can mean for a very long time indeed, if those contradictions are backed by force or backed by something we respect or fear. The basic contradictions in this propaganda have gone largely unnoticed, right? So the claim, for example, that there's no Ukrainian state, that the Ukrainian state is oppressive, or the claim that there's no Ukrainian nation, but all Ukrainians are nevertheless nationalists, or the claim that there's no Ukrainian language, but that Russians are being forced to speak the Ukrainian language, or the claim that Russia is defending the world from fascism, whereas many of its actions seem to rather be in the other direction. These things are basic contradictions of an essentially Aristotelian type. They clash with one another in a fairly elemental way. But do we notice this? How much have we noticed this? I would say relatively little. And that's a sign, or a basic sign of how well this is working. Getting used to contradictions is part of the point. Getting used to being lied to is part of the point. Thinking that you can't trust anyone because everyone lies equally, that's basically the point, right? That you're living in a world where trust is not possible, or whereas if you're naive to trust anyone, that's part of the point. Because if you can't trust anyone else, then civil society is impossible, right? Then the government wins, or certain kinds of governments win. So the thing which is sidelined in some basic way is truth, and the thing which is exported, I think which has been very successfully exported, is distrust, right? This is in fact a Russian export, right? Russians have enough distrust of their leaders that they can afford to export some of it to Europe, and that is what has happened. And this way of exporting distrust works very well. Because insofar as Europeans and Americans also distrust their leaders, the way Russians distrust their leaders, the Russian state is in a relatively better position compared to everyone else. Now, I define this as the philosophy, but of course you could also invert the entire way of arguing this and say that it's the tactics, because this is happening from day to day. This kind of philosophical challenge is a day-to-day challenge. At least if you're in contact with the Russian media, it's a day-to-day challenge. And this business of what's a lie and what's the truth or what's not contradictory, it isn't just an exercise, which I'm going through with you. It has to do with life and death in a very precise, documentable way. So to go back to MH17, right? Why did those people in MH17 die? Well, the simple answer, and I think the most important answer, is because Russia had invaded Ukraine. There were Russian tank battalions in Ukraine. Russian tank battalions are accompanied always by anti-aircraft because the enemy of tanks are fighter planes. The Buk anti-missile defense has a friend and foe distinguisher, which only distinguishes between Russian planes and everybody else. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm saying something that everybody knew last summer, or everybody who mattered knew, right? The leaders in Germany, the leaders in the Netherlands, the leaders in the United States knew that Russia had invaded Ukraine, that there were Russian tanks, Russian tank crews, Russian anti-aircraft in Ukraine. We knew all of this, right? But we didn't like to say it. We didn't like to use those words, the kinds of words that I'm using now, because who knows, on the one hand, on the other hand, everyone has an opinion. Maybe it's not invasion, maybe it's an incursion, maybe it's intervention. Let's talk about how we talk about it and do that some more, right? Why is that bad? Well, because if you do that, instead of reasoning clearly, you don't do the obvious thing. So why did those people die? They died because a Russian tank crew shot them down. But they also died because people in the West who had all of the necessary information did not draw the obvious conclusion and reroute civilian air traffic. And the reason we didn't reroute civilian air traffic is that we were not allowing ourselves to think clearly. So this is it's a relatively small example of how it matters that you don't think clearly about the things that you have, which is where I want to end now on this question of truth. So when I say that, when I claim the title that this is not, that this is a war of truth or a war for truth or a war against truth, I don't mean banal things like that. Ukrainian propaganda is true and Russian propaganda is not true. Ukrainian propaganda is pretty awful and it's often not true. What I mean is that the success of the Russian propaganda has moved us into a world, I think all of us into a world a bit together, in which certain kinds of truth, which we admittedly have been questioning ourselves, we can see what matters when we question them or when they're eliminated. Let me just close by listing some of those kinds of truth. I already listed one of them, which is Aristotelian truth, right? Just the principle of non-contradiction, that we're not allowed to contradict ourselves, right? That's one kind of truth, which, I think we've already said goodbye to. Another kind of truth, which is relevant here, is legal truth. So the truth of the legal relationship of a citizen to the state, for example, that you are citizens of the state you're citizens of, regardless of what language you choose to speak, or regardless of what civilization, whatever that means, you happen to be part of. That there is actually a state and there is actually citizenship. There's another tradition, of course. It's a tradition of Carl Schmitt, which takes a completely different view on these questions. That's a tradition which Russia is reviving. A third kind of truth is existential truth. That is, the truth about what you choose to do, what your true motives are, that you sometimes take risks, right? That you might take a risk and die. That kind of truth is denied in a different way. If everything that people did on the Maidan, right, was just a matter of geopolitics or just a matter of some kind of plot, some kind of another, if we accept that, as many of us have, we're then denying those individuals the ability to leave a trace, right? To say who they were. To take a risk for their families, for their country, for Europe, whatever it might be. We're getting rid of existential truth when we accept these larger categories. And the most important one might be social truth, this business of distrust. So if you think something is true, or if you're testing out your own beliefs, what do? You talk to people you trust, right? Whether online or whether in reality, whether on the phone, but you have some group, right? Some group where more or less official doesn't matter, where you try your ideas, you're working forward. What if you don't have those groups? Or what if you you don't trust any one of those groups? Then that kind of truth is very hard to develop. And that is the relationship which we call civil society. There can't be civil society if nobody has that kind of group, right? If you don't trust one another to talk about things, everyday things, not just politics, then there can't be civil society, right? So getting rid of civil society is part of being rid of a certain kind of truth, which I'm calling social truth. And of course, if you reason then backward from these kinds of truth, you realize that, fine, we can say we can talk about how they're all relative and they're constructed and they're historically conditioned and yada yada. We can do that. I'm happy to do that, but not for all 20 minutes of Q&A. Please spare me. But we can do that, and it is of course all historically contingent. But these kinds of truth happen to be the kinds of truth that the political and social structures we take for granted are based upon. Right? The idea of existential truth is the idea behind human rights. The idea of social truth is the idea behind free association. Right? The idea of legal truth is the idea of a sovereign state. The things which we have, and which Ukrainians in some measure don't have, and which we all take for granted. Right? These kinds of truths are the basis for the structures that we're in. And this is why I say, or I said at the beginning, when we talk about this war, it hasn't gone as well in Ukraine as the Russian leadership expected that it would go. What has happened instead is that the actual fight in Ukraine has become a relatively small part of a much larger campaign of undermining, mostly I think through these political and intellectual means, what have been successful structures to the west of Russia, sovereign states, the European Union. In that sense, the war for truth is the war which is actually being won, or, depending upon your point of view, lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Snyder. And that was great, and I'm sure will have stimulated a lot of thoughts and questions in the audience. So, who would like to?
If you could identify yourself when you ask a question, when you ask a question, could you please ask a question?
Absolutely. One question each, please try and keep it short. Let's start at the back. A microphone?
Can you hear me?
Microphone coming. So please give your name and then one question.
So, Maidan to me, and thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. One question, do you see this conflict, the conflict between sort of sound like that election, or whether you see that as a conflict between, say, European leadership and the current leadership in Russia? As is there hope for communication moving on?
Yeah. So I see it in a slightly different way. I mean, of course, there are, at an empirical level, there is a conflict between the Russian Federation and the European Union, which consists in the Russian Federation trying to weaken or disintegrate the European Union. There's a conflict, there's a certain amount of pushback the other direction, there are sanctions, there are states within the European Union that have policies. But what I'm trying to argue is that that's not the fundamental level. And I wouldn't make a distinction between civilizations. Rather, as I see it and experience it, of course a lot of this is subjective, right? It has to do with spending a lot of time in Russian and in Ukrainian, in Russian especially. As I experience it, it's all one civilization, right? I see very little on Russian television which doesn't remind me, I mean admittedly in a hyperbolic form, of something that I haven't seen on American television or British television for that matter. The techniques were not developed in Russia. The techniques were generally developed somewhere else. They don't have this kind of restraints that one might have on Fox News or on Sky News or whatever, but they've learned a lot from the world. And so in that sense, I think it's wrong for us not to notice that there's a certain kind of exchange going on, where techniques that generally came from New York or California are being perfected in Russia, and then the content is then being brought back to Europe and the United States. So I wouldn't want to make that kind of distinction. But I will make a distinction which is maybe more old-fashioned, which is between two ideas of what political society is. Where one idea is that there's a fruitful relationship between civil society, state, and some unit which is larger than the state, right? In this case, the European Union. That, for example, you need a non-corrupt state to join Europe. Europe will help the state become non-corrupt. Occasionally, civil society has to butt in and push the state, right? And that's something which has happened in the last 25 years in a number of places. In Poland, moments in Slovakia. That story of a positive, fruitful relationship between those three levels is one theory. I think it's slightly grandly, but one theory of what political life is or should be like. Another theory says the only thing which is really real is the state. And civil society doesn't really exist. And there are people in Russia who say things like this, but also Margaret Thatcher said things like this, right? So the civil society doesn't really exist. If people form groups or associations, that doesn't have any significance. It doesn't have any standing or any legitimacy. The only thing that matters is the state. And the things above the state don't really matter either, right? The European Union doesn't really have any right to exist. It's a kind of perversion. Now, in this theory, naturally, in practice, we work against civil society, and you work against this because you want to dominate those people below you. And also, if you break up the European Union, you are in a much better relative position, right? It's much more fun to deal with Schroeder and Berlusconi and individuals than it is to deal with a European Union, right? So I think it's different. It is actually a difference between two theories of what political life is supposed to be like. So is there hope? There is. I mean, there's more hope in Russia than one might think. There might be less hope here, though, than one might think.
All right. Question here.
Thank you. I'm Najam Abbas. I work for the East-West Institute. Have you given any thought to the what-if scenario if in February of 2014 the agreement which was backed by France, Germany, European Union with the opposition that Yanukovych would continue till November 2014, elections will be held, where it would have left the European security and the Crimea issue then? Thank you.
Yeah. I haven't given a lot of thought to that counterfactual, and I'll tell you why. It's a really demanding counterfactual because while Sikorski, so this wasn't an EU initiative, by the way, it was a Polish initiative where the Sikorski brought the German and French foreign ministers along. But while they were sitting negotiating, as I'm sure you all know, while they were sitting negotiating, the people were being murdered by snipers from rooftops. And it was that mass murder which made the continuation of Yanukovych impossible. So for me, it's such a demanding counterfactual because the question is not, could that have held? The question is then, why were Ukrainian forces murdering those people in large numbers? And as I see things, to have that counterfactual, you then have to have the counterfactual, why is Medvedev offering $20 billion to suppress, this uprising? And then to have that counterfactual, you have to ask, why is Russian foreign policy turned against the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to have the counterfactual that you want, you have to roll all the way back to 2013, ask why Glaziev has suddenly become important, ask why Russian foreign policy is turned against the EU. So for me, I mean, as a historian who only likes very small counterfactuals, it becomes a very, very big counterfactual, and therefore I don't give it a lot of thought, is the answer to your question.
Thank you. I'm Pete Duncan from Seas. That's on thing. Cheers. Timothy, lots of things I'd like to say to questions, but I'll just stick myself to one. Why, given that you agreed that you said that the Ukrainian government also does not stick to the truth, why did you focus on the Russian lies? Because the truth is in Britain and the West generally, we don't believe the Russian lies. We know they're lying all the time, but we have somehow let ourselves get persuaded by the Ukrainian government in Kiev that they are reforming, they're trying to fight corruption, which clearly is not the case, but they're drawing us in behind them. Thank you.
Yeah, so you've answered your question. The reason why we pay attention to Russian propaganda, not Ukrainian propaganda, is the Ukrainian propaganda is totally ineffective, right? I mean, if you can stand and say, if you could take 5 seconds and undo it, and it takes me an hour to deal with Russian propaganda, assuming roughly equal capacity for this sort of thing, I think you've answered your own question. The reason I take Russian propaganda seriously is that RT has a huge annual budget. It exists in English around the world. It's the second most watched channel. I mean, your view that no one in Britain believes it is hugely over-optimistic in my experience. And even if people don't believe it, it's not supposed to be believed. It's supposed to shape the way people think. It's supposed to shape debates. And it did so in this country as well. This country also had a 9-month-long debate basically about whether Ukrainians were fascists or not, which was 9 months when you were not thinking about other things that you should have been thinking about. I focus on Russian propaganda because it's huge and because it's effective. RT also exists in Spanish, it now exists in German, and it really affects the way discussions take place in those countries. It even affects the United States to a surprising extent. Also, the reason I focus on Russian propaganda is that it's conceptual. It's about how you think or whether you think, right? Whereas, as you say in your question, the Ukrainian propaganda is much more about stuff that doesn't happen. It's mostly we won a battle at place X when there was no battle at place X. It's very, very conventional and also ham-fisted. Now, as far as the reform question, I mean, here I think you're on to the crucial subject area. The crucial subject area, in my view, is precisely Ukraine as a rule of law state. And that question goes beyond whether one believes Poroshenko or Yatsenyuk or any particular individual. It goes to the question of supporting the Ukrainian state generally. I'm happy to entertain the argument that one shouldn't give lots of unconditional aid to oligarchs. But that's and no matter how sweet they are, how much one likes them, and to entertain the argument that the way that one supports the Ukrainian state is by going for local structures or NGOs, right? But the idea that we don't support the Ukrainian state because its leaders lie, I mean, I wouldn't go there because supporting the Ukrainian state, at least as I see things, is part of supporting the European system, which has worked so very well. So I guess that's enough on this question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm curious here.
Sorry, no, up there.
Does it work? Hello. My name is Janek Potowski. I work at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Two very quick questions. You said to ask, so I'm asking, what did Putin say to Yanukovych before the Hindu side? And if Moscow is winning this war, how do we turn it back? How do we win this war on truth?
Yeah. Okay, so as to the first one, right? Your guess is as good as mine. It might be the same as mine, but I suspect. And persistent rumors fairly close to the Yanukovych regime also claim that what Putin said was, if you don't go along, we'll take Crimea. And one reason to think that this is true is that they obviously already had the operational planning in effect to take Crimea, right? The way that they took Crimea in early March 2013 was not something that was planned between November 13 and late winter of 14. I mean, it was something which clearly had been in the making for years. People have been, Ukrainian officers have been bribed for years. And that thing, it was carried off so beautifully, as opposed to Luhansk and Donetsk, because it had been in the works for a long time. So my suspicion is that that's what Putin said to Yanukovych. If you don't sign, I will give you this much money, and I won't take Crimea. If you do sign, you're not going to get this money, and I will. That's my suspicion. But that's just. That's also. It's not only my suspicion. It's kind of it's verges on being a consensus. What can we do? I mean, I'm trying to set. I'm playing defense, right? I'm playing defense against people who have a ton of money and lots of airtime. What I'm trying to do is to give a certain shape to this phenomenon that we're dealing with, in the hopes that if we see that it has a shape, we won't be battered around by it so much day to day, and can start thinking about how to answer your question. Obviously, I mean, the implication of this talk is that there are certain things which are important to us and which we take for granted. The things that I mentioned in the talk, all of which are more fragile than we think. Right? Because your generation and the generation up, and even the one above that, have grown up in a Europe where, or at least this part of Europe, have grown up in a Europe without war, with roughly speaking increasing prosperity, with the welfare state, et cetera, et cetera. And historically, like totally unprecedented set of events. Nothing like this has ever happened before in Europe or anywhere else. And there is a kind of belief, and here you've all become, I mean, with apologies, I'm sure they're needed, you've all become kind of American, like in the sense that, like, so when we invade Iraq, we think, okay, we knock over a state, everything's going to be great because life is just beautiful that way, right? This sort of optimism that no matter what happens, like democracy springs up, like weeds or whatever, which was our political theory going into Iraq. Europeans are beginning to think. It was. That was our political theory. Okay, we didn't use the word weeds, but that was the basic idea. The basic idea was that human nature was such that if you clear away everything else, democracy, that was the idea. That was the idea. We have a whole school of political science which says that. Okay, stop me from making fun of my country, please. So Europe, surprisingly, 15, 20 years on, has become a bit more like that. That you can quarrel as much as you want about like leaving the European Union or separatism, or it doesn't really matter, because the assumption is all this good stuff that we've got, free travel, free trade, university exchanges, marrying Italians, all this good stuff that we've got is not going to go away, right? But it could actually go away. I mean, the European Union in 10 years could not exist. The European Union, these countries in Western Europe in 10 years could look much more like they did in the 1920s and 30s. I'm not, just putting aside the whole Second World War and that business. The 1920s and 1930s, with the nation states having relations, are nasty enough as a comparison, frankly. And you could be back there very soon. And I think one place to start is not to take what you've got for granted, to realize that it could be in a regime's temporary perceived interest to take it away from you, and that they could succeed. That's about as far as I can go. Defending your civilization.
Lady in the center.
My name is Han, I'm a student here. I'm curious about the policy and public response on the War of Truth from East Central Europe, in particular Poland. You just mentioned that if this integration of the system doesn't resonate so much in the West, certainly on the mind of the Polish public. But you also said there are Russophile orientations from Prague, from Budapest. So I wonder, how would you assess the Polish response so far, and what would be possible and desirable policy initiatives in the future? Thank you.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So let me make 3 points. The first is a historical one. The countries that experienced the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are basically surprised by nothing. Right? They have a clear-eyed way of seeing this, which separates them from the rest of not only Western Europe, but from the rest of Eastern Europe. Right? So the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Poles, the countries that were invaded by the Soviet Union in 1939, they're not surprised by Russian propaganda about states not really existing, because that was the Soviet propaganda in September of 1939. They're not surprised by alliances between far left and far right, because that was what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was like. all the things which are so weird that we have trouble even processing them, they take as normal and are not surprised. So those political elites are not surprised. The states that are beyond the Malta-Arbitro zone, even if they were touched by post-war communism, like Czechoslovakia, don't quite have the same like anti-totalitarian sensibility. That's one thing. Second thing is, Russia is, I spoke of Russia having client states, but in a way that takes subjectivity away from the client states. You can be Hungary and you can see Russia as a model for rule, right? You make a certain kind of arrangement with the oligarchs, and you manage democracy and you go on forever until you die. So Russia can be a positive model inside of the European Union as well. And it happens to be for Hungary as far as one can make out, right? For whatever contingent reasons, that relationship seems to be working. The third thing I wanted to say is that there's another place where Russian propaganda doesn't work that well, and that's in about 90% of Ukraine, right? Now, it's working. It worked quite well in some parts of Ukraine for some time. It's working less well now, even against the Heights. But in most of Ukraine, interestingly enough, it doesn't work all that well. Of course, people in Ukraine have different opinions about what's happening. But in general, it's interesting how, like, all this stuff that I spend a lot of time explaining, like, this would be an illegitimate talk, right, in Lviv or Kiev. I would just be wasting people's time. I mean, some of the terms I use might be different, but mostly I'm saying things that are intuitive. But as far as the broader base of your question, which goes away back to this question, like, what does one do about it? I mean, what I find interesting is that you can't really respond to this without admitting that there is some kind of European social or political structure, right, that has some kind of coherence and some kind of history. If you don't admit that, then you can't notice that someone's taking it apart. Like, and a lot of European politics and cultural life depends upon not defining what it is that all of you are actually engaged in, which is in some way beautiful, but it's turned out not to be so beautiful right now, because if someone defines themselves as your adversary and they actually understand to a large extent how you work, then the posture of, well, ever closer union, and automatically it's going to keep going, everything, that posture then becomes kind of suicidal.
Right, there are lots of people who want to ask questions, but I'm feeling for Professor Snyder's voice. So I think what we're going to do is take another 4 questions and then call a halt to this. Gentleman up there.
Richard Perry, my company's called India Savvy. Can you give me some advice for my English friends, for my friends who tell me that Ukraine is Russian anyway, Crimea is Russian anyway, and what are we fussing about, because why should we be worried? What do I tell them? Because I'm lucky enough to have the truth sort of given to me from on the ground, but I'm just looking for a smart answer, because at the moment all I can think of is saying, well, it's a bit like asking Putin to come and protect the Russians in London from Nigel Farage. It's so preposterous. It's kind of, is that on the same level? Am I being too clever or not very clever? Or what would you say to my friends? And the second part is, should we ramp up the sanctions, and are they working at the moment?
Well, I mean, I tried to address that a little in the talk. The idea that the Ukrainians are all Russians, it's like saying that the Canadians are all Americans. I mean, it's just like that. Nationality is not based upon these observable cultural things. It's based upon political experience and a sense of solidarity. And the thing which is supposed to have made the Ukrainian nation cease to exist, this war, has in fact mobilized Ukrainian political identity much more than I think any other experience in history. That's the irony of all of this. The fact that Ukrainians speak Russian, as far as is neither here nor there, right? I speak English, and that doesn't mean that I'm yearning for protection from London, right? I occasionally yearn for like the taxi cabs, but I don't. It doesn't. It's just the logic of it doesn't make any sense. It's only a way of dismissing it. And even that Crimea was always Russian. I just find that fantastic, and it is kind of a sort of an argument for why we should have more history or something, because of course nothing was always Russian. I mean, Russia itself hasn't been around for that long. I mean, part of what's interesting about all this is that we take for granted that Ukraine is all fluid and yada yada, so we apply like our best postmodern critical thinking to the Ukrainian nation, and we take for granted the Russian nation. The Russian nation's in formation, right? I mean, what is happening now is actually crucial for Russian nation. The fact that Russia's engaged in this war is crucial for Russian nationality formation, just as the fact that Ukraine is fighting the defensive war is also crucial for Ukrainian national formation. There's never been a Russian nation state, until 1991. There was an empire, there was a Soviet Union, but there hasn't been a Russian nation state. They're both in a way like Austria and Germany. I mean, after the Second War, if you like, or after the First War, it's not. They have their certain things in common, but they're political nations that are forming. And what people actually do or choose to do is so much more important than like whether Vladimir converted or didn't convert in 988 and all of these things. What people actually do now in both Russia and Ukraine is triply important. Anyway, with Crimea, as you know, I think it's all about shale gas. But the Crimea was, of course, part of ancient Greek civilization. It was then one of the last strongholds of the Tatars. It was a Hanat there for a long time, which eventually became a suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire. A lot of Ukrainian history has to do with the interaction, Polish history too, with the interaction between the Tatars in Crimea and the Cossacks and the Polish army. That went on for centuries, right? And as President Lukashenko rather beautifully put it, I don't know if anyone else has been paying attention to this, probably at least somebody, but Lukashenko has become very funny on Russia lately as part of his new campaign to demonstrate their Russian sovereignty. And Lukashenko made the point that if you say that Crimea is Russian because of Russian ethnicity, then you have to also say that Moscow is Crimean because of Crimean ethnicity, because after all, the Crimean Tatars were there first, right? So Lukashenko argued that as soon as Russia annexed Crimea, the Tatars could have just as legitimately annexed all of Russia using the same ethnic logic. That's not me, that's President Lukashenko, right? So, who is not a great historian, right? He's got other capacities, but the fact that he can think his way out of this box, and your friends and mine can't, is a little bit what I find disturbing. So anyway, to finish with Crimea, Crimea is an island with respect to Russia. It's a peninsula with respect to Ukraine. That's why they shifted it to Ukraine, and also because they thought Ukrainian farmers would do a better job on Crimean soil. So the story that it's always been Russian. The reasons why Russians think that, the dachas and the retirements, there are reasons why they Sevastopol, the history of the Russian Empire, they're perfectly legitimate reasons why they think of it as part of their history. But the idea that a land is always of an ethnicity, is sort of itself certain.
Maybe
Hi, my name's Yaroslava. So I was interested in how you define the rule of law in the West as kind of a cause for its political predictability. And I'd say that the Russian foreign policy, starting from when Putin steered Russia's path towards democratization in a completely other direction. I think that it's on this contrast that the current kind of conflict is built. So my question is, what are your predictions on, future scenarios? For instance, to what extent do you think that Putin is ready to invade the Baltics? In that scenario, do you think that NATO would actually intervene? Do you think that he just wants to maintain this frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine, or is he ready to move to Kiev? What are your kind of predictions?
Okay, so on the question of the nature of this conflict, this is something I didn't say very much about, and which in a way your question went to as well. One of the things that Ukraine and Russia have in common is oligarchy, and one of the main political questions is how you handle that. There is the Putin solution to how you handle that, which is specific to his being from the KGB. As I understand things, this may be way too broad brush, but the key political question in Ukraine now, as 10 years ago, is how you move from something like clan pluralism or oligarchical pluralism into a real pluralism, right? And to do that, you need some luck. You need a couple of nice oligarchs, like we had, like the Americans had. You need a couple of nice ones. Libraries, foundations. Art's fine too. Okay. That was a specific reference. So that's the larger political question, which the war has gotten in the way of, because the war, I use the word counter-revolution a lot for a reason. The war forces a counter-revolution, because when you have to fight Russia, you fight with what you've got. And what Ukraine had was its oligarchs, and so hence Taruka, hence Kolomoisky, right? In some sense, hence Poroshenko, you have to fight with what you've got. But that said, that then can very easily become, an excuse for not doing things which need to be done, which is where we are, I think, basically now. As for the, you know, and in an odd way, like, and this is a sort of formulation which can offend everybody, but in an odd way, what has happened is that the weakness of the oligarchical state in Ukraine has been shown twice by very different forces. I mean, both by Ukrainian civil society and by the Russian army, right? In different ways, the limits of that state have been shown through different kinds of challenges. And neither of these things should have been able to return to state in some sense. Okay, on the future, I made a bunch of predictions which were true, which is like, I really want to rest on my laurels now. Like, I predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine at a time when everybody, you know, mocked me for it. I predicted that Putin would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which he did. I predicted, this is a later prediction, but I predicted that that the conflict was not going to be about Ukraine, but it would be about Europe. And it's with that prediction that I will answer your question. If I were them, I would not push on Article 5 because there's no need to. Things are going so well inside Europe now that if you just continue along present policies, the European Union will hollow itself out. And then eventually then it becomes meaningless. I think if you press on Article 5 now, you then force the Americans to respond. I think, yes, I do think the Americans would honor Article 5. I do think NATO works in that sense. But there's no need to test that right now if you're Russia. There's just no need to test that. So I think the Baltics are somewhere in line, but I think they're after cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, and they're after Moldova probably, and they're after just continuing to push against the EU. So I mean, I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong about how they see this inside the Kremlin. Right? I don't get invited to tea parties anymore. I'm not in a book club, but there is a book club. No, there's a book club. They read together. But my sense is it's going better for them in Europe than they expected, and worse in Ukraine than they expected. And therefore, they're encouraged, you know, to keep the push in Europe. So what I expect is more support of the far right, more governments tilting towards Russia, more of this inside the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Austria. That's what I expect.
All right. Two final questions. Gentlemen here and then on the record.
Yes, my name is Henrik. I'm a student at SEAS. I was going to ask you, what should the West be doing then? What should the European Union, what should NATO, what should the US be doing? The other day, the UK decided to send a few troops, advisors, to Ukraine to help them. Is that what the West ought to be doing? Should we ramp up the military game? Is flexing our muscles the only way to make Russia back off?
Okay, so sorry, this is part of your question too, and I ignored it. So what's interesting about all this is, although many of the Russian initiatives have gone terribly wrong. Like so I think, you know, getting Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement, that was not supposed to lead to popular protests. Paying the regime to put down the protests was not supposed to lead to revolution. Invading Crimea was supposed to make the Ukrainian state collapse, which it didn't do. The intervention in Donetsk and Luhansk was supposed to unleash popular fervor in favor of Russia, which it didn't do. A lot of the things that they've done have not worked out and indeed have escalated. But they have shown a lot more stick-to-itiveness than we have. So in their general campaign, you know, there's a reason why it started in 2013. In their general campaign to find the painful places to push that European integration, they've been pretty successful. And if you see Ukraine as one of those, then you see, well, this is a fairly consistent policy. They win some, they lose some in Ukraine, but overall, what they're doing is fairly consistent. We have not been so consistent, either the European Union or the United States. Admittedly, the European Union has a substantial policy of sanctions. One can certainly imagine a counterfactual in which that didn't happen with slightly different leaders of European nation states, and that in a way is impressive. It's the first such European foreign policy, but there's a lot of dissent about it, a lot of disagreement. The American sanctions are much less impressive. In general, like American policy of just, you know, the American like two-pronged policy of claiming that you're the only superpower and that because of economics you always win in the end. Like that's not actually a policy, right? That's a sort of declarative victory dance. So the answer to your question that goes back to other questions is something, for me, I think it's something like this. That if you buy some version of this talk, that like the intellectual or moral foundations of the political order are what's being weakened or what's under attack, then you have to go back and ask, well, what can you do to support those things? So the answer is not to fight back the way that they're fighting. I mean, maybe in some small areas, yes, but in general, if you said, okay, we're going to make the BBC like R2 now, right? Like that would not be winning, right? That would be losing. I mean, okay, admittedly, it's fun to think about for just a few seconds, but it would be losing, right? Having all American news become more like Russian news, that would be losing. In fact, it's sort of, I mean, a small glimmer of hope. What I find terribly interesting is that the journalism of reporters who actually go to Ukraine has been amazingly good, and has been, in a way, the one thing which has held the Americans, the British, and especially the Germans back from like total intellectual vacuity. The traditional journalism, like from Die Zeit, from the Spiegel, even from Süddeutsche Zeitung, from the FAZ, they've been the best. The Polish journalism, the New York Times actually had correspondence there, and some British and French correspondence too. Their story's been a very mixed one, but it's like very concreteness and sort of palpability has weakened, the sort of totalities of the propaganda line. So one small thing that one should really be doing is paying attention to actual journalism as opposed to like the images, which are just which are meant to work on the back of our brains. But in general, I mean, as far as policy, when we talk about arms or we talk about sending military advisors, this should be part of a policy to support the Ukrainian state, which is a flawed entity. I mean, going back to this question, it's a flawed entity. It's corrupt. It's spectacularly corrupt. But the main difference between the way the European Union handles the state and the way Russia handles the state is precisely what do you do with weak states, right? I mean, Slovakia in 1993 or Poland in 1989 was also they were not tremendously beautiful examples of state capacity, right, or anything else. The way that they interacted with the European Union was meant to provide positive feedback loops to help build state capacity, right, over the long run. Ukraine now is not in any better position than these places were, 20 years ago, but it may not be in a much worse position either. And, or even let's say it is. But I think the fundamental premise has to be that the way that we play the game is that we accept sovereignty and we try to improve sovereignty, right? And that involves a kind of long-term approach. So what I worry about is that the people who support the ceasefire in Minsk and the people who want to arm Ukrainians instead, like in some sense they're both wrong, or they have the same position, because they think, okay, if we do one thing or another, if we push the right button, it'll be over. It's not over. It's not going to be over. It can't be resolved in Ukraine, because it's not about Ukraine. Right? It can only be resolved at the level of supporting the European state system of which Ukraine is a part. So I see it as like a 5, 10, 15-year investment, which has to assume that we don't know what's going to happen in Russia. Right? I mean, the present regime in Russia, which we're sort of taking for granted in this conversation, is not something we should take for granted. There's no, sanctions are hurting them a little bit. They're totally contingent off the screen event of the Saudis dumping oil on the market is hurting them a lot, right? It has nothing to do with the war, right? But so, I mean, as Clausewitz reminds us, when you start a war, then unexpected things start to happen. And so how long the Russian regime is going to last, or this particular version of it, we don't know. Whether it's going to be what's out there in 5, 10, 15 years, we don't know. And so the whole game of like thinking about what Putin is thinking is in some sense, just a kind of hypnotic way of not facing the issues. Admittedly, it is hypnotic. But so the question is like, what do we stand for? And I think the answer is we stand for taking states seriously and trying to help states in the eventual hope that those states can then be capable of cooperating on their own.
Okay. And the last word to Andre.
Dear Professor Snyder, I would like to thank you for your lecture, but also I would like to thank you for your quote from November that concepts are just labels for argument. And if I may, can I ask you a conceptual question? 99 years ago, different Snowden said that in war, the truth is the first casualty. In that sense, is the war for truth in Ukraine an oxymoron? And if so, does it mean that we are actually accepting Putin's game by playing this war game for truth? And if so, is it actually possible for us somehow to push this concept of war out of Ukrainian mindset and our European mindset in order to concentrate on re-establishment and development of the system of checks and balances in Ukraine to fight corruption? Sorry. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid that no matter how I answer your question, I can't make the war stop, right? And so, like, we can, like, however we parse the question, however we answer it, there are certain things that are happening. And I mean, we can't make the war for truth go away by redefining it, right? So, no, I don't think we can say that because it's subjective or because it's conceptual, it's not real, and then we can move on to other things. It's real precisely because it is conceptual, and it may not much affect the way you think or I think, but it does affect the way that many, I think hundreds of millions of people think, and not just in a tactical way, but in a long-term strategic way. If I'm at all right, then the existence of structures that we take for granted depend upon implicit assumptions, which are themselves fundamentally the target of all of this. So no, I don't think one can put aside the question of truth, and I think that even the defense of the Ukrainian state, as I so inarticulately responded to this question, even the defense of the Ukrainian state starts from your view about the truth of certain kinds of politics, right? Like if you think, for example, so let's just take a very simple proposition. Oligarchy and the rule of law don't go together very well, right? I assume you think that's true. I certainly think it's true. But in order to make progress on any platform of reform, you have to have some sense of how things are actually working and how things work. You have to have some kind of political theory. So I think a situation in which the kind of conventional political theory that you're advocating, checks and balances, for example, a situation in which all of that is called into question is not a good situation. Now, I agree with the spirit of your question, which is that the war is not an excuse for not reforming. I agree with that, but that, unfortunately, part of the success of all of this is that it makes it among other things hard for the West to think about how to support Ukraine, because we basically do two things. We try to figure out what's going on, which takes a lot of time, and then we try to find small tactical things that will make it all go away. Whereas the true answer is in the middle. I think the true answer is if you accept that there's a European system, which depends upon, I'm claiming there are other versions of this, depends on some fruitful interaction of civil society, state, larger European project, then you have to support those three. Levels. But if the whole goal of the other side's policy is to make you forget those things and to make those things blurry, then you have to accept that there's some reality out there that you have to work against. So.
Thank you so much. With that being said, I would like to thank Professor Snyder for this time. If you could follow our students to Seas, where we have 40 bottles of wine, we can share. We got it from our department, and we are not paid by anyone. Thank you very much for your time.